This is Ashley Klein from Prevent Connect, and I am happy to welcome you to our web conference today on equity, trauma, and sexual and domestic violence prevention. Prevent Connect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or CalCASA. So we know today, as we talk about sexual and domestic violence, that all communities are impacted. But we also know that the rates that folks experience sexual and domestic violence vary by many different factors. And so systemic inequities and multiple forms of violence contribute to high levels of trauma. And so we're really hoping to look at how we can address these realities in our prevention efforts. And so you'll see the objectives we have today, infusing equity and looking at not just individual trauma, but also community trauma, using an asset or strengths-based approach to prevention with respect to community culture, identity, and other factors. We really want to explore the importance of individual and community agency in our change efforts. And then we'll be sharing some tools and resources. So with that, I am going to turn this over to our wonderful host here at Prevention Institute, Casey Castaldi. Casey will introduce our other co-host, but thank you so much, Casey. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks so much for that run-through and the introduction. My name is Casey. I'm a program assistant here at Prevention Institute, and I am joined today by Elisa Samji, who's a program coordinator who will be helping sort of facilitate this conversation. And we will soon be joined by Lisa Fujie Parks, who is a program manager here. I also want to just give a quick shout out to our wonderful web tech, Allie, who's here today. Allie is helping us keep this show rolling, and I really appreciate all of her help throughout this process. All right, so as Ashley said, we are really happy to be here today to have this conversation about how to infuse themes of equity and trauma into our SDV prevention work. And so we have really great guests today who are going to share with us their work pretty soon. But before they do, I just want to give you a sort of a quick introduction to the material in case you weren't familiar, or a quick refresher in case you are. And so when we're having these conversations about community trauma, I think it's important that we start off with a sort of common definition of what community trauma is. And so community trauma is not just the aggregate of individuals in a neighborhood who have experienced community trauma, who have experienced trauma from exposures to violence. There are manifestations or symptoms of community trauma. And so really community trauma is the cumulative and synergistic impact of regular incidents of interpersonal violence. It's historical and intergenerational violence, and it's the continual exposure to structural violence. And so this definition was developed as a part of our Adverse Community Experiences and Resilience Framework that we published earlier this year. And this framework really just takes a look at community trauma and the effects that it has on the community level determinants of health and safety. And so sort of in the context of today, we really wanted to look at what the effects of community trauma and inequity are on entire communities, and more specifically, how those inequities relate to risks of sexual and domestic violence. And so what we know about these connections is that first, structural inequities from historic and present-day policies, practices, and norms have led to inequities in rates of SDV that exist by age, sex, race, socio-economic status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other factors. And also that communities that face higher rates of SDV often also face inequities in other forms of violence and trauma. And lastly, that we know that multiple forms of violence and systemic inequities contribute to higher levels of community trauma. So sort of with all that in mind, what we're hoping to do today is really discuss how it's really important to think about the impact that community trauma has on communities and populations and the individuals that we work with in sexual and domestic violence prevention, and how we can embed a community trauma lens into our work preventing SDV. And so our guests today are going to help us, share what they've been thinking about in their work, and hopefully, share their unique strategies that will spark some great conversations. about how to do this, how to infuse community trauma and inequity lens into our work. So with that, I want to sort of get an idea of where you all are at in our audience in thinking about community trauma. So we're going to do a polling question. So you should, in the bottom left corner, you'll see 4 options, and we want to know, how has your organization started thinking about community trauma and equity in relation to your SDV work? And so A is, I've never heard of community trauma. B is, I've heard about it, but haven't really started thinking about addressing it in the work. C is, we've already started conversations about how to address community trauma. And D is, I'm actively addressing community trauma in my work. And so, Alicia, what are you seeing? And I think Allie has shared that, or will share it.
Yeah, so we see that a lot of you have started thinking about community trauma, and specifically 42% of you have maybe not have heard about community trauma but haven't thought about addressing it in your specific work. But we do see some of you have started conversations. We have 30% that have already spoken about it through their organizations, and a few of you have even actively started addressing it in your work.
That's great. I'm glad that we have sort of a wide range of answers, so hopefully today will be helpful for all of you. And so now we're going to just also do a quick text chat question for some more context, and we have sort of a few options. We want to know just what general questions you might have about community trauma and how it relates to STD prevention. And then also, if you've already started, which I think some of you have from what I see, what ways are you already addressing community trauma in your STD prevention work? And so we will come back to these questions throughout the web conference. So if, as we discuss, please feel free to add any other questions you might have, and we'll hopefully get back to them with our guests and, throughout the web conference. All right, so with that, that quick introduction, I want to get started by introducing our first set of guests who are from Virginia. And so before we get started, I want to do a quick sound check with Leslie to see if you are able to join the line. Leslie, are you there? And you might have to hit *6 to unmute yourself.
Hi, Leslie's here.
Great, Leslie.
I love technology.
Glad you're able to join. And Adriana and Katie, are you there?
Yes, this is Katie. I'm here.
Great. So, and Adriana, are you as well? Sorry, Adriana, are you on the line? Just want to make sure.
She's working on it.
Okay. Well, we'll get going, and then we'll come back to Adriana. But just some quick introductions.
Okay. This is Adriana. I'm sorry.
Okay. No worries. I'm glad you're here.
Thank
you.
We'll
start with Leslie Conway, who works at the Action Alliance. She began work there in August of 2012 as their Prevention Community of Practice Coordinator. She travels across the state to provide ongoing technical assistance and support to local SDVAs on current prevention trends and initiatives. She also works with a team of prevention professionals to develop resources that build on current prevention trends, and she is one of the original creators of Do You, which is a campaign that we'll talk about a lot more later today, as well as Ask, Listen, Respect, which is an initiative to support parents and educators who work with middle school youth and have conversations about consent. And Katie Moffitt is joining us from the Laurel Center, where she is the Sexual Assault Prevention Coordinator, which started in April of 2015. She earned her Master's of Social Work from Virginia Commonwealth University in 2010. And Katie has worked as a clinician and adjunct professor for WVU and in teen dating violence prevention. She is passionate about social justice, racial equity, and violence prevention. And lastly, we have Adriana Myers, who is also joining us from the Laurel Center, where she started in May of 2015 as the Sexual Assault Prevention Specialist. She completed her Bachelor of Science in Psychology at Longwood University and holds her Master's of Science in Education from Shenandoah University. And she provides parenting classes and teen groups in Warren County and Clark County, as well as a psychoeducational counseling, crisis intervention, and hotline response. So thank you all so much for joining us. We're so glad to have you all and to hear about all of the great work you're doing in Virginia. So
Great, thank you.
Yeah, great. So since there are three of you, we're going to try and split this up and give you all some time to talk about your work. So we're going to start with Leslie, and we're hoping you can just give us a little bit of insight into the state-level work that you're doing with Action Alliance, and more specifically, what trauma prevention and equity framework or strategies have you been using to inform your work?
Okay, yes, sure. So the Action Alliance, as folks may know, is a member-based agency that's made up of local sexual and domestic violence agencies around the state of Virginia that work with state and federal partners to provide training, technical assistance, resource development, policy advocacy for our members statewide. So we believe that our work to respond to and prevent sexual and domestic violence work in tandem with other movements, other important anti-oppression work. There's an interconnectedness is how we view our work. So understanding this, we started to look at our work through three connected lenses. And the first being, let's see if I can work these slides correctly, our racial justice lens, as well as our trauma-informed lens and our asset building. Those are the three lenses that we tend to do our work through. And when we put these lenses on, we discovered that all of our work got better. Our prevention work was informed by our racial justice work and vice versa. Our trauma-informed advocacy was informed by our prevention work and vice versa, and our racial justice work was informed by our trauma-informed advocacy work. And, so on and so forth. That's how we started to view the work that we were doing. From our racial justice lens, included in our organizational mission, is a statement that acknowledges that understanding the great harm that racism has created for individuals, families, and our communities in Virginia, as well as within the Action Alliance, we commit to building an anti-racist framework from which to address sexual and domestic violence. In Virginia, African American and Black women in particular are victims of family and intimate partner homicide at a rate almost 3 times as high than that for white women. And so this is the result of disparities in access to community resources, justice, and safety. And all of these disparities in access are a result of racism. So for these reasons and more, we have an agency believe that providing effective advocacy and doing work to end violence also means investigating these root causes. In terms of our trauma lens, we're looking at our trauma approach through also through elements that we consider to be asset building. And in the next couple of slides, and actually I'm going to move ahead to that slide, these are the elements that we tend to do our work in terms of having that trauma-informed response. That safety is one of those things that we want to be able to ensure physical and emotional safety, trustworthiness, maximizing trustworthiness, making tasks clear, maintaining appropriate boundaries, choice, prioritizing consumer choice and control, and then we have collaboration, maximizing collaboration and sharing of power with our consumers, and empowerment, which is prioritizing consumer empowerment and skill building. So all of these elements are asset building. So a trauma-informed approach is asset building, and building skills that foster empowerment and choice and control. All of those things are also prevention. So our connection between trauma-informed advocacy and our prevention work is very clear. And in addition, so much of the trauma that people experience is historical trauma. So, and that's the trauma that is cumulative and across generations. So our trauma-informed work is also linked to our racial justice work. So that, again, is our interconnectedness, that we have to consider the trauma of racism and or oppression in the context of someone surviving sexual violence and intimate partner violence and the meaning associated with these experiences. And when we look at our asset building lens, and just to kind of go back, when we look at our asset building lens, we understand that building assets or protective factors across our work is crucial to ensuring resonance with our clients, our community members, and those that we work with. So obviously in our primary prevention work, our mission is to increase conditions that will help all of us thrive throughout our lifespan. So we want to build skills so that, we don't harm others. We want to build families that are nurturing and loving, and we want to build those communities where we feel safe and we have access to learning and recreation and information, all of those things that will help us feel connected to our community. So we just felt that this work was so fundamental that we wanted to look across our work and try to incorporate asset building into other areas. So this is kind of how the Action Alliance, the framework that we do our work from, how we got to this framework. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much for that. It's great to see sort of the progression of how your work was informed, as well as how well it's played into sort of the theme of the whole season, which is connecting this work that we're doing in STD prevention to other social and racial justice movements and other movements in general. So thanks for that. So moving forward a little bit, I want to head back quickly to the text chat because I see that there's been a lot of movement. So I want to head over to our team here in the PI office to see what's coming up in the text chat. And if we don't get to your question, there will be ample time to move forward. But what's coming up?
Yeah, so this is Alicia, and on the text chat, we've had a lot of discussion about defining community trauma. And so just to redefine it for you, it's the cumulative and synergistic impact of regular incidents of interpersonal violence, historical and intergenerational violence, and the continual exposure to structural violence. Delores actually shared a good example with us about the relationship between Black communities and the police. And we do have one question that I thought I would pose, and that's about how do you address community trauma when you don't identify with that particular community, which was asked by Stevie Kelly. And Katie Paul actually asked a very similar question as well, which is how do you work with communities that are different from the primary makeup of the employees in your organization and the resistance of these different these different communities might have to working with you. So basically, how can you address community trauma when you're maybe not from that particular community or people at the organization you're working at aren't part of that community?
Leslie, do you maybe want to touch on that or feel comfortable with that?
Yes. And actually, I think that's that question is a great segue into what our folks from the Laurel Center are going to be talking about how to build those community relationships, because really it's all about relationship building and getting to know the community. And that's just a part of just in any form of relationship. How do you build those relationships? You try to find those commonalities, and start from there. So I know that, again, that Katie and Adriana are going to be speaking to that piece. So if it's okay, I want to kind of digress and wait until they have that opportunity to address that.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think you're right. And maybe we can just move forward a little bit to our next question we have for you, Leslie, which is just about, giving us a little bit more information about how the curriculum was developed and what equity and trauma considerations were made during that process. So I know you have some. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm there. Yes, so we frame most of our understanding about what the research says about assets and positive youth development on the Search Institute's Developmental Assets. So the best available research is the information that was derived from scientific inquiry that exists in determining whether or not a prevention program, practice, or policy is actually achieving its intended outcomes. So basically it's saying, did it do what it was supposed to do? So the more rigorous the evaluation and its research design, its implementation, and the extent to which it has been replicated in different settings and different populations, the more compelling the research evidence indicating whether or not a program, practice, or policy is effectively preventing violence. So the best available research that we had at the time was the research from the Search Institute, and we looked at the developmental assets when we were looking at creating the Do You campaign. And some of the assets that it was a group of an advisory committee. So we had an advisory committee with prevention experts, prevention advocates in the state of Virginia, but also focus groups working with and talking to teams that this particular campaign was designed for. So based on what we learned from these groups, it told us that their experiences in the field, we narrowed down to 2 internal and 2 external assets that we wanted to build through our programming. So these are the 2 internal assets that we wanted to build off of: interpersonal competence, that the young person has empathy, sensitivity, and friendship skills, and then the positive personal power, that a young person feels that they have control over the things that happen to them. On the external, the factors that exist around them, we wanted to build on the community values youth asset, where the young person perceives that the adults in the community value who they are and what they have to say, and as well as positive peer influence, that their friends also modeled the behavior that we were looking for, or that, responsible behavior. So those are, that's how we kind of got to develop, those were the back of how we were developing Do You. So again, Do You is that strategy that we use to get to these outcomes. And Do You addresses youth violence and dating violence by confronting the root causes of, by enhancing the protective factors, building resilience to promote positive development and healthy relationships. The target age for this campaign is for 13 to 16-year-olds. Each session of Do You is open with a bridging statement that links them to the last activity. It has an experiential activity to engage their minds and to prime them for whatever work they're going to be doing. And then they have a creative activity where they're actually working in, it's a magazine, they call it a zine, and that's what you see in this slide here, is one of the teams actually working in their zine, and that helps them to engage their right brain, make connections, and explore further. And then there's a sharing and discussion piece about the content and the process of what they were doing. When we designed Do You, we specifically worked with the African American community because we wanted this information to be relevant for that community as well. So, it's really no good in having a particular strategy if it's not going to, work for or follow our mission of being something that impacts the racial and gender divides that sometimes we face in our society. So that's what Do You is about.
Well, thank you so much for that.
Again,
I appreciate that. Sorry, go for it. What were you saying?
No, I just, again, I don't want to go into what is going to come with Katie and Adriana, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background of how we came about to design Do You.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I know that Katie and Adriana are going to talk, like you said, a little bit more about that and how Do You is playing out on the ground. And so as you can see, I want to, before we go to hand it over to Katie and Adriana, I wanted to sort of pull up the text chat and see what the audience is thinking. So as we talk about this one particular program and curriculum, I'm really curious in the audience how any of you have adapted programs and curricula to better address inequities and community trauma. So if you all could head over to the text chat and let us know what you have done or have heard of. We would love to know. And while you all write in, we're going to head over to Katie and Adriana, who will tell us a little bit more about their program. And so I'll head to you first, Adriana. And I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit more about the students you've been working with and the activities that you've been doing with them. And Adriana, you might be on mute, so we can't hear you.
Yeah, I think I figured it out. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to say a little bit about what kind of communities we're working with. We're from the Laurel Center, and we're a dual domestic violence and sexual assault agency in the northern tip of Virginia. And Katie and I both work in somewhat rural areas. We make up our prevention team at the Laurel Center, and we're RPE funded, just to give you a little bit of background. We have a lot of prevention programs, but we're focused today on the Do You, the work we've done with Do You so far. And my work with Do You has primarily been in Front Royal, Virginia, and all the programs I have been running have been at non-traditional, non-residential programs for youth who have either been having issues with truancy or behavioral problems. And Katie's been working in Frederick County and Winchester City and has been facilitating Do You in residential settings and mentor groups in conjunction with the NAACP. So many of the teams that she's been working with are from high-risk communities due to poverty, history of abuse and neglect, and racial inequities as well. Front Royal, on the other hand, is a new community for us at the Laurel Center. We just expanded there a couple years ago. It's a very tight-knit and isolated community, so it's been difficult to establish programs there, but I also know that that is also a strength for that community. So that's just a little background of where we're coming from. And as you can see, hopefully on the screen, I've listed the 10 activities that we do with the Do You program. It has been really well received in all of the areas that we work in, and this is what we do in the school-based setting. So during the duration of the 10 weeks, the student create that magazine, that zine that they end up keeping at the end of the groups. And since the program is creative expression-based, they get to use all of those art supplies. They have stickers, which they also really love. And they're particularly surprised I was at the participation during the values auction. During that activity, the participants get a certain amount of play money, and they're able to purchase the values that they find to be most important. They have a list with some values like feeling good about themselves, having nice clothes, or a good job, being pretty or handsome, or avoiding abuse in a relationship. And overwhelmingly, the girls that I worked with would bid on having the freedom to make their own choices. So I thought that was really amazing.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much for that sort of background of what that looks like. I want to quickly head over to Ashley and Alicia to see what the text chat has been saying. I see there's a lot of...
Sure. Yeah, Casey, thank you. This is Ashley. I mean, there's some great stuff coming up here. So things that I'm noticing, a lot of folks seem to be working with community partners to kind of tailor things that they're doing and placing them in the context, and I think Emily said this, of the social, historical, political, etc. context our lives take place in. So definitely weaving that through the efforts here. And Reshima said that they've been using the Search Institute's 40 Development Assets through the United Way of Delaware. And maybe we can get a link to that in there. But Alicia, what else are you seeing?
Yeah, one of the interesting things that came up was about offering options other than calling the police for bystander intervention training. And I think really involving the people who programs are for in creation of the program, whether it's collaborating to develop program strategies with youth advisors, or including conversations in groups with people of the same gender.
Great. Well, I think that is a nice segue into sort of my next question that I am going to pose with Katie, which is we talked earlier just about relationship building, and I think that's coming up a bit like Alicia said, is just really involving the community that you're working with. And so I'm wondering how sort of you integrate this approach into sort of working with individual and unique communities and with, in young people, and how you shape the work with each individual community you work with.
Hi, this is Katie. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure. Oh, okay. I will try. We've got a storm maybe getting ready to come through, so that might be a part of it. So for us at the Laurel Center, the most important part of the work we do with individuals or communities is to first find ways to let them lead, because it's all fine and well for us to walk in and say, we know what to do, but that doesn't go a long way when you're trying to develop rapport. So Do You fits really well with this mindset. It allows students to freely express themselves in a creative and safe space. Students have reported far fewer triggers while using Do You compared to other curricula we've used, and appear to be less drained by the activities preceding the creation of their zine page. But really, Do You and our approach in general is to allow the individuals and the communities we're working with to lead, because they know best. They know what they need.
Great, and the static is coming in pretty strongly. Maybe if you all could share a phone, Adriana. You are having.
Yeah, let's see if Adriana's will work. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's great. And thank you for.
It's mine.
Thank you for.
Sorry, we're trying to get hers back on and then use just hers. I apologize.
No, it's okay. Thank you. I think it'll be better long term. Make sure that we can hear you.
Okay. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Okay. That sounds better. Okay, so thank you so much for that. I want to quickly, before I ask you your next question, Katie, head to the audience again for another text chat question, since you all have been really helpful so far. So we really just want to know ways that you and the audience have incorporated ways to promote individual and community agency in your work in order to be responsive to inequities and community trauma. So I think that you touched on that a little bit, Katie, already. But yeah, we're also curious, like you mentioned the community, knowing what's best, but how does your work really strive to increase individual agency and community agency? And you might have to unmute yourself. Katie, we're having a little trouble hearing you. You might have to.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can. Perfect.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
So
you sound a lot better.
I'm sorry.
So we're glad we can hear you.
Okay, great. Would you mind posing the question again? I apologize.
Yeah, of course. We're just wanting to elaborate a little bit more on the work that you're doing to increase individual agency and community agency. So I know you touched on that a little bit, but I know you had some sort of narrative example or.
Yeah, so one thing we've done is to fit the needs of our community, we realized that we really needed to reach out in non-traditional educational settings because we want to reach as many people as possible, especially those identified as high risk, at risk, or people that are part of marginalized or underserved groups. That means we've had to make adjustments with our partners. We've partnered with local agencies like the NAACP and found some really, really good partners there. in doing this, we have had to adapt and adjust a little the way that we do things because we found that that old adage of if I scratch your back, you'll scratch mine doesn't really work if you have an agenda because people can see through that. So we really try to work with people as best as possible to meet their needs along the way. I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to move along my things here. So empowerment is really important to us as well, and we've done that by allowing groups to kind of lead themselves, and DoU allows that space for students to feel safe and creative. An example of this is I ran a mentoring group along with the NAACP in town, and we used the universe activity, which was mentioned in an earlier slide, and boys and girls kind of put themselves into gender-specific groups on their own without any of our direction. And when this happened, students started working on their own and then shouting from table to table at each other, and one boy even took it upon himself and walked over to the girls' group and was saying things like, oh, you need to make sure you put hot on your universe and things like that. The girls understandably didn't enjoy this and wanted the boys to know that they didn't appreciate this kind of attention. So it actually organically led to a discussion about how do you let somebody know you're interested in a respectful way. And then the students were able to really take that discussion and make it their own.
That's great. Thank you for that example. I think it was helpful. And thank you for sharing just all of the work that you've been doing on the ground. I think it's great to see, sort of hear the roots of a curriculum and then see how it's playing out in the field, which is really great. We have a few minutes, and I want to head back to the text chat and just see if there are any recent responses to the last question we asked, as well as any sort of outline questions we can answer in the few minutes we have with these folks.
Yeah, so this is Alicia again. We had an interesting initiative shared by Jill. She was talking about how they set up a volunteer task force to help deliver primary prevention in their community. And so this was based on a community summit where there were people from different systems such as healthcare, law enforcement, religious affiliations, social services, so a wide range of people involved, and how through this volunteer task force, they actually had a campaign called Mighty Mentors, which featured male community individuals that were mentors for ending sexual and domestic violence. And so I know this was posted before we asked the question, but I think it still relates to having these mentors featuring, you know, male leaders in the community to help end sexual and domestic violence. So I thought I'd share that. Anything from you, Ashley?
Yeah, I think Emily brings up a great example of being really intentional in how the work is being reflected. So Emily says that in materials, the language, photos, and locations, we try to reinforce the message that we believe everyone in the community is part of the solution. So really being intentional in how you're displaying the work that you're doing. And then Alma talks about at the Wisconsin Coalition, promoting leadership and advancement within the organization with assistance and guidance from the Women of Color Network. I think those are good examples.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing those examples with us, and thank you so much to all three of you, Leslie, Katie, and Adriana, for sharing the work that you're doing in Virginia and how it's really starting to take trauma and equity into consideration in a really real way. So with that, I think we are going to now head over to our guests from Delaware, Noelle and Lauren. We're so happy to have them join us as well. So Lauren is the Empowerment Evaluator at the Delaware Coalition Against Domestic Violence. As the Empowerment Evaluator, Lauren provides training, technical assistance, and coaching using an empowerment evaluation framework to support evaluation activities and build sustainable evaluation infrastructure. And so she supports statewide and within local communities in order to guide, improve, and sustain intimate partner violence primary prevention efforts within Delaware and nationally. And finally, we have Noelle Duckworth, who is the Director of Training and Prevention at the Delaware Coalition. And in this capacity, Noelle has provided oversight for their Delta program for intimate partner violence prevention, their RPE program for sexual violence prevention, and the Delaware Coalition's Domestic Violence Specialist Certification Program, as well as their training and programs and offerings. And she is born and raised in Delaware, so we're happy to have you both with us.
Hi, thank you.
Great, so let's get started by just really hearing a little bit more about the work that you're doing in Delaware, and more specifically, how are you approaching community-level trauma, and what does that mean for the communities you work in?
Sure, thanks. Thank you. We're just to frame a little bit, we're calling in from our state's largest city, which is beautiful and vibrant Wilmington, Delaware. However, Wilmington, as we see on this slide, has sadly been coined Murder Town, USA by some national media. And our city of about 70,000 had a 45% jump in shootings, for example, from 2011 to 2013. Recent years, the growth in Delaware's homicide rate has outpaced that of every other state. To better track the shootings and homicides within the city, our local newspaper built an app to help map and organize all the incidents going back to 2011. How do I advance this slide? Why isn't it advancing? There we go. All right. So whenever new incidents occur, they do update this feature. And since we actually sent these slides to Casey, sadly, men, women, and children have been shot, and the year-to-date incidents have increased to 96, and the number of victims have increased to 109. So this time last year, we had about a dozen less victims and incidents, but 3 more homicides. Wow. Now, it needs to be stated, I think, that any crime rates should be taken with a grain of salt, and that this data really does not fully represent our city. In fact, in the People's Report, it's going to be listed in the resource section of these slides. It's a 2010 participatory action research study in 2 of Wilmington's neighborhoods that was led by Dr. Yasser Payne at the University of Delaware and his research team of community residents, who found that despite an overwhelmingly presence of physical violence and diminished opportunities, psychological and social well-being was thriving. Among the 520 young black men and women interviewed, 80% said they were happy or very happy these days. So it's important to look at multiple, sets of data, obviously. That said, these increases in crime did lead the city, with support of the State Health Department, to invite the CDC to come study Wilmington's gun violence. And Councilwoman Hanifa Shabazz, who initiated the resolution that led to the study, said that the violence, felt like an illness and an epidemic, and called for the need for healing. The study examined, when the CDC came in, Wilmington residents arrested for a violent gun crime between 2009 and mid-2014, and looked for certain risk factors in their lives, such as whether they had been unemployed, received help from assistance programs, had been possible victims of child abuse, or had been shot or stabbed. The final report called for the development of a risk assessment tool and the linking of data to create a better understanding of which individuals might need early comprehensive help before becoming a victim or perpetrator of violence. It was also suggested that integrating data systems would be a component of community-wide efforts to prevent multiple forms of violence and help measure the impact of strategies that address underlying risk factors. So a few months after before the final CDC report was issued, our coalition hosted a conference in the city and invited Dr. Pinder Hughes as our keynote speaker, who introduced many of our partners to the community-level trauma framework that we were talking about today. But before I get to that, I think it's imperative to note that Delaware partners have been actively engaged in efforts to apply a trauma-informed lens to services, organizations, and systems. So, for example, in 2004, we started working with Dr. Sandy Bloom, who developed the trauma-informed sanctuary model, and that's been adopted by several of our domestic violence programs. In 2009, our coalition had the opportunity to become one of 8 sites working on trauma-informed advocacy and training in a project led by the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. So we've had significant leadership in our state on this movement. We're very fortunate. We're founding members of Trauma Matters Delaware, a statewide steering committee made up of an amazing and truly dedicated group of state and community-based agencies working to make Delaware trauma-informed across systems and services. And also, the Delaware Coalition is funded by CDC's Delta and RPA programs for intimate partner and sexual violence primary prevention, and our efforts emphasize strategies that address outer layer work, so things to improve environments and conditions in which people live, work, learn, and play. So these conversations around trauma, prevention, equity have really been occurring simultaneously and really align well with our coalition's anti-oppression and social justice philosophy and framework. So consequently, our understanding of trauma has expanded, and we've started to approach it as both this individual experience, defined traditionally as an emotionally painful experience that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, as well as this more collective experience, particularly for whole communities like Wilmington, who are enduring chronic and pervasive adversity. So if you've ever attended a trauma training, chances are the paradigm shift has been framed as the movement of services and systems from asking what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. And with the community-level trauma and resilience framework, it stands that our understanding of trauma as a collective also requires a shift from what's wrong with this community to what's happened to this community, including asking what role our organizations and systems have played in that. So thinking about Wilmington, community forums have identified toxic stress as a key driver. People have pointed out that Delaware is the first state to ratify the U.S. Constitution, but we were also the last of 3 states to ratify the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. And so more recently, there's 2 things that typically come up in our health or safety meetings that are often viewed as major drivers of disparities and violence. And one is, in 1963, despite protests and lawsuits from residents, the federal government seized and demolished more than 350 homes, businesses, and churches to make way for I-95. The highway paved over major streets and carved out a new community called West Center City, which is a present-day hotspot for crime. You can see here, like before, when you looked across your street, there were manicured lawns and neatly kept streets. But when you turn around from this picture that I took and you look across the street on this corner now, you can understand why people continue to describe how the interstate carved and hacked through, that's the words people use, hacked through the center of our city's heart. And then it made these massive concrete bridges as one's neighbor. So before the highway was built, the city was connected by corridors serviced by trolleys. Then just a few years after 95 was built, riots sparked by the assassination of Dr. King broke out in Wilmington, led to a citywide occupation by the National Guard. Our former Mayor Baker, who was a social worker at the time, called MLK's assassination as the straw that broke the camel's back. And 20 vacant buildings were destroyed, but Wilmington's riots were pretty small compared to other fires and fatalities in other cities following Dr. King's assassination. However, the governor at the time deployed the Delaware National Guard and kept them in Wilmington for 9 months, the remainder of his term, and after the violence had subsided, despite pleas from the mayor for him to reconsider. This became the longest military occupation of an American city since the Civil War. So I'm not a historian, but our point here is that learning and understanding what's happened to a community from the community's perspective really helps frame the work and our understanding of what are manifestations of community trauma. And these symptoms are, sociocultural, physical built environment, economic. So again, for example, this is one of the many memorials for victims across our city. And just thinking about the impact of the physical environment, this is what you see when you look across the street.
Thank you so much for that sort of insight into Wilmington. I think some of those stats were pretty overwhelming, and I know there was a question from the audience about whether or not that data was, I think, general, just crime stats, or whether it was specific to DV and SB. Is that correct? And my impression is that those are general crime statistics, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So I think that this is great, and I think it really ties back into sort of what we were saying earlier about the connections between multiple forms of violence and community trauma, and that, it increases risk of exposure to violence in the future, including sexual and domestic violence. So thank you for giving us that background. I want to ask you now, so with all that, with all the violence occurring in your city, what has changed about the way that you've approached your work and the strategies that you've used due to the community trauma that your community was experiencing and is experiencing?
Sure. And I'll try to make those connections on why we don't have sexual and domestic violence data up there, but how that still impacts our strategies. Can I advance?
Yeah, of course.
So one example is with our CDC RP-funded strategy to engage men in sexual violence prevention. So Delaware Men's Education Network, Delaware Men, and Alicia Drew is our staff member. She's on the chat function. She couldn't join us in preparing for this webinar, so please weigh in, Alicia. I'm talking about her work primarily, and it feels awkward. But Delaware Men is a statewide coalition-building strategy that mobilizes communities, and we have a diverse network of MOU partners. So we have an LGBTQ community center, an HBCU, a faith-based neighborhood center, a military base, the National Guard, who I just talked about, a large state university, and a college that caters to non-traditional students, and a community group working with Black and brown urban youth. So partners work to implement prevention strategies and connect and go through this journey together. And the coalition's role is to try to create safe spaces for dialogue, learning, networking, and planning, guided by the group's core values, consensus decision-making, storytelling, deep listening, and a real clear commitment to each other. So our network partners work very hard to show up and work at each other's events. They co-host and share resources. They just spent the past year co-hosting the Mask You Live In film screenings. So, students at the historically Black college invited the Air Force Base and the Guard over, and they sent members and all viewed it together and had dialogue. And then the other thing that we emphasize is really on contribution and value over power or credentials. So partners who have less access or privilege are supported and validated in their expertise and wisdom, and are provided with resources and opportunities to lead to the best of our ability with the resources, of course. The coalition provides training and TA to help community partners, implement community-driven strategies and work with folks to address the trauma that can result from boys and men being exposed to traditional masculinity, as well as trauma that men from marginalized communities can experience from chronic adversity. So we explore men's role in, redefining traditional manhood, promoting healthy fluid masculinities, and then at the same time we're trying to connect network partners across the network and build safety and connectedness as a protective factor, while also helping individual partners do that in their own communities. So it's like with building community within and across. And many of the engaging men strategies that our partners and the broader field uses are related to bystander intervention, but our partners from different communities different challenges in identifying their norms and promoting safe bystanding. So, for example, some members of bystanders who intervened and were later killed by perpetrators, or if bystanders put their lives fine in an attempt to escalate.
Noelle, you're breaking up a little bit.
Let me try taking it off speaker.
Okay.
Oh, my. We're really having issues with the phone today.
It always happens like that, but if you could just repeat.
Yeah, so so partners shared about how, oh, no. She doesn't think it's her phone. Okay, I'm holding it. So for example, some of our partners also are located in Wilmington, and not long after we launched this initiative, an innocent bystander was killed about 1 city block from our office while protecting a woman and a baby from a man with a knife. The community recognized the bystander as a hero, but the local paper also quoted friends as saying if he had just minded his own business, he'd still be here. So despite the evidence and effectiveness of bystander strategies, this really underscores for us the need for a community trauma lens as we take into account conditions and structural inequalities and environmental barriers that leave really few options for people to bystand without putting their personal safety at risk. So from a statewide network standpoint, we think would be really responsible for our coalition to promote these kind of one-size-fits-all approaches to all of our partners, without working with our partners to better understand their perceived and actual norms and community-relevant and culturally specific strategies. And so, for example, Project PIN, Performing, Informing, Norming, is a partnership that we have with Art Fusion, Inc., which is a local theater group, and it's developed under our CDC Delta-funded practice-based evidence strategy efforts. And essentially what we do is work with communities that are interested in having us come in and set up some performances, interactive skits, to gather some community-specific data around, and we use these clickers like you use in sometimes in higher education you've seen, and it's like a live feed system that allows actors to improvise based on the audience response and interaction. And so they collect their very own data during the interactive skits, and we've piloted this so far in 3 communities, in a university serving non-traditional students, to over about 500 airmen and women at Dover Air Force Base, and to an all-boys middle school. So, if you can kind of figure out how to further mesh the word edutainment with data collection, that's kind of what it is. I guess edu-datainment, maybe? I don't know. Then we host social norms theory and messaging workshops with the community leaders to debrief their data and talk more about how we can, how they might want to use their data to guide and inform community-relevant media and messaging campaigns based on social norms theory and best practice. So the goal is to, meet communities where they are, be strength-based by helping communities focus on their desired actual norms and correct those misperceptions, while also helping partners apply theory, use data-driven efforts to move behind those one-time awareness events and really engage in something more comprehensive in a really easy way, an informative way. So the actual norms had desired behaviors over perceived norms with 2 of the sites, so there's clear opportunities to correct those misperceptions and promote pro-social norms. However, at the middle school in Wilmington, the data was much more ambiguous and certainly uncovered community-level trauma. So as a result, we got some funding from our state's Division of Prevention and Behavioral Health Services to do some more listening sessions with men and boys in Wilmington over the summer, and we're still transcribing that data. But the boys shared a lot of insight about barriers to bystanding, what things that they can do, think need to be done to help the situation. And here's just some quotes. Some of their barriers to extend from community trauma. So one group, the majority of the boys had expected to get shot in their lifetime, and every single one of them had seen someone shot. So, and another interesting thing is that the framing of a hero when you're talking about bystanding stood out. So thinking like, if I need to be a hero, but if I do, I could get killed. So it really made us think about, and it certainly wasn't surprising given Wilmington's rates of violence, but it really made us think about our role in not further harming communities or coming with them with a, see something, say something kind of campaign that really didn't take into account the conditions in which they already are living and how hard it is just to survive. So those are just some examples of that work that's still kind of underway. So.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think sort of what I was hearing a lot is, and what you were saying was just really about, like you mentioned, being responsive to the needs of your community and where they're, and meeting them where they're at to a certain extent. So it's interesting to see how that sort of lens is playing out in the work. And so I want to ask, I'm going to head over to Lauren soon to ask a little bit about how this work has been playing out sort of in the later evaluation stages. But before we do, I want to head over to the text chat and ask a question of the audience, which is really just about how any of you have incorporated an asset strengths-based approach to STD prevention that is responsive to inequities and community trauma. And so I know we heard Noelle talk about really looking at, the assets in Wilmington and how to incorporate that into the work. So we'd love to hear sort of what you all are doing. And I think while you all write in, we'll have sort of a larger chunk of time to head back to some of the questions that have been continually coming up in the text chat. And we'd love to hear your answers to this. And so while you write in, we're going to head over to Lauren. And I'm really just curious about how your approach has looked in the implementation and evaluation stages.
Great, thanks. I just want to start by saying that we're truly building this plane while flying it, but hopefully I can share a brief illustration of some ways in which we move from that more theoretical space into application with one, in particular with one of our local prevention programs. As part of our CDC-funded Delta prevention work, DCADV partners with one of Delaware's local DV agencies on implementation and evaluation of Safe and Respectful. Safe and Respectful is a primary prevention strategy that is focused on strengthening community connectedness and improving the physical and built environment in neighborhoods in a particular geographic area in northern Delaware. To give you a quick overview of Safe and Respectful, really quick overview, it's primarily centered around implementation of the evidence-based youth empowerment solutions for positive youth development, or better known as YES, violence prevention model. It's a curriculum-based program developed out of the Prevention Research Center at the University of Michigan, and it consists of 3 core components: a multi-session curriculum on youth leadership and empowerment, intergenerational partnerships with adult neighborhood advocates, and planning and execution of youth-led community change projects. But Safe and Respectful has embedded YES into additional wraparound programming that also includes gender equity content, educational leadership building, field trips, building and strengthening healthy peer relationships, and coordination with the agency's other community-based services. There have been adaptations along the way that are directly related to the acknowledgement of the historical and perpetual oppression and community trauma experienced by the neighborhood where Safe and Respectful is being implemented. The local agency implementing the program has had a long-standing presence within the community, providing various services for many years. This deep understanding of the decades of trauma, isolation, disinvestment, violence, substandard housing, adversarial policing informed early program planning decisions for Safe and Respectful. First and foremost, Safe and Respectful's main purpose would be to create and provide a safe space for youth navigating community trauma and at times their own individual traumas on a regular basis. Prioritizing that safe space, though, means rigid implementation schedules go out the window. Implementation is fluid and flexible to respond during each and every session to what the kids bring into the space that day, whether it's a fight at school, family stress, or a drug raid on the street right outside the youth center. This also means authentically honoring the proverbial meet them where they are. While we definitely take a strengths-based approach, we also acknowledge the disempowerment and oppression the youth in this neighborhood have often experienced, often by institutions or programs meant to help them. We know we need to understand and unpack this if the youth participating in Safe and Respectful are to feel truly supported in their development of their leadership and empowerment. We've attempted to account for this by adapting the model to include many opportunities for youth to take a leadership role in decision-making and planning before launching into the large-scale community project. With all of this, the bottom line adaptation is that the community and the community context sets the pace for implementation, which admittedly isn't easy and can cause a lot of tension for us when it doesn't fit neatly into rigid funding timelines or due dates. But in addition to some of the structural adaptations I just mentioned, we've also deliberately incorporated some specific trauma-informed content into implementation, like workshops on self-care strategies, as well as this community-wide event that was planned in part by the youth. This particular event shown here featured a performing and teaching artist who was a storyteller, poet, vocalist, and musician, and who performed original works as well as works from the African and African American folklore tradition with the purpose of reinforcing values and supporting community members in thinking critically, identifying safe and healthy strategies of resistance, and building resilience. As the evaluator at the Coalition, I'd be remiss if I didn't also talk about how we've also been deliberate in incorporating a trauma-informed framework into our evaluation efforts. Some quick examples of ways we're trying to go about doing this include expanding our use of qualitative data collection methods like interviews and focused conversations. It's a lot more work on the back end, but it allows for much deeper context to be part of our data and also allows for data collection to be more intimate and transparent and to be a shared experience. We also try to utilize more participant-involved or participant-driven data collection using things like storytelling or photo voice. Another practice is to identify as many already existing opportunities for generating useful data by capturing data as part of activities rather than separate from. We do this through observational journaling of session activities or community events, documenting the outcomes that we see, feel, or experience from the perspective of the youth as well as program staff. And just to give you a very specific example from early on in our planning of how our acknowledgement of community trauma influenced evaluation, during the initial review of the youth survey that's provided with the YES curriculum, we noticed the original survey included several measures that asked youth to indicate how often they engaged in specific risky behaviors like alcohol, tobacco, and drug use, as well as youth violence. We made the decision to remove those items from our survey, even though the original developer of the model considered these to be core outcomes for the program, because we felt strongly that asking these questions violated the safe space we wanted to establish and that the items reinforced the persistent negative stereotypes of that particular neighborhood and were potentially triggering, not to mention they weren't very strength-based. We don't necessarily agree that these need to be considered core outcomes of the program, but we feel that we're able to get a sense of that data through qualitative methods and inviting you to share that information if they feel it is a meaningful part of their story in the program. So just to close out, I wanted to highlight some actual data generated by the use of the program using photo voice on the current physical conditions of their neighborhood to document assets and liabilities. Overall, the sorting of the images was fairly straightforward, but a debate broke out around the playground. Some youth coded the image as an obvious community asset, but some of the youth quickly pointed out that the playground should be coded as a liability, and you see for the responses there below for the reasons why. Ultimately, they decided that the playground was both, but that they also came to the agreement that this should really be the focus of their community change project because they felt after that in-depth analysis that the playground should be a community asset and that they wanted to work to make sure it is. And that's all I have.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. It's really great to see how this lens and this type of thinking is being sort of extended to every step of the process and how you can definitely hear the community voice throughout all of the work that you're all doing. So we are sort of getting close to the end, and before we do, I want to sort of bring all of our guests back for some final questions. I know that we've posed a lot of questions and that the text chat has been, active, and there might be some questions from earlier we didn't get a chance to. So I'm going to turn it over to Ashley and Alicia, who can potentially pose some questions to our guests or just bring out any sort of overarching themes that have been coming up.
Sure. So I can start off with sharing some of the themes that have been coming up. So a little while ago, we had Emily James share about how designing volunteer materials, how they're focusing, on strengths-based through intentional choices that focuses on the diversity and uses language, photos, locations that reinforce that the community should be part of solutions. We also had some comments about helping individuals and community identify their strengths so that discussions recognize survival and resilience isn't always about the trauma and violence. And I also wanted to uplift something that was about organizational practices. So Alma Mann had shared about the Women of Color Network, how they've been working together to promote a leadership and advancement within the organization. And I think Ashley shared that before, but I wanted to focus in on how we can even think about our organizational practices. But I do have one question that I would like to pose, and this is something that was raised quite early on in the web conference. And this question is, it says, I work with domestic violence offenders. How have others addressed this while still withholding men accountable for their violence? So I guess, how do you balance accountability and addressing trauma? And I'm not sure if Noelle and Lauren, if you'd like to answer this, if you'd like us to.
And we also recognize that this might be beyond the boundaries of this discussion. This is Lisa from Prevention Center. So feel free to comment if you do have a comment, but also feel free to pass if it doesn't make sense.
Well, I think that, one of our I'm going to skip ahead to one of my kind of reflections on this work, is that, as a domestic violence advocate, I've always been trained on victim-centered advocacy. So if a victim, is calling or contacting for services, and we're meeting the victims where they are, we're working on empowerment advocacy and letting victims guide their options and choices and supporting them. And so, one of the questions, most advocates get trained to ask is something like, what is your biggest fear or concern? And what we've learned is with an empowerment advocacy model, when you ask a victim what that is, you've got to be prepared for that answer. So if the answer is not, well, I'm worried about the violence that's going to happen in my relationship tonight, but I'm worried about, getting evicted from my home because of X, Y, and Z, and where myself and my kids are going to live next week, that's the biggest concern. And as advocates, our responsibility is to support survivors and victims with those needs. So that's why there's such a diversity in the service provision at domestic violence agencies. And so I use that framework to guide, this community-level trauma framework around if we're working in certain communities, and a community says, I say, what's your biggest concern or need? Even though I'm there with a domestic violence and sexual violence strategy, like some of the things we talked about today, and the community says, my biggest need is that I'm worried about my child getting, not living to 18, or I'm worried about, police brutality, or I'm worried about, the impact of structural violence and racism, then our role in working with that community is to get behind those issues and do that work. And so I think we have to show up and do that work. We have to think about ways to be present and be involved and not, and work together. It doesn't mean you put down your domestic violence advocacy hat or your accountability hat with offenders, but you've got to be present in the community in which offenders are coming from and understand those larger structural things that are in place. There's one school nearby us that 51% of the children have a relative who's incarcerated. If you go into that school and don't understand that, that's really going to change how you engage and understand the trauma that those kids have experienced. So I don't think that specifically answers your question, but maybe in a theoretical way.
Thank you for that. Ashley, is there anything else that's come up?
There was closer to the beginning, in response to the first question that we posed about how, in what ways are you addressing community trauma in your prevention work, Coy Adams had a statement that you have to have a structural intersectional framework. And so really starting with that. And I think Dolores, maybe in response to what Noelle was just sharing, that sometimes doing this work, we do have to recognize that folks can be both a perpetrator and someone who has experienced harm, and that's the nature of addressing structural violence.
Okay, great. So thank you all for sort of your continual text chatting, and to our guests for your just responses and willing to answer these questions. So as we wrap up, we have about 10 minutes left. We wanted to just really get some key sort of lessons or recommendations from our guests just about doing this work and incorporating this lens. And so we're going to bring back both of our guests, but we're going to start with Delaware. Just Noelle and Lauren, just if you wouldn't mind sharing some of sort of your key learnings and recommendations. with the audience today.
Sure, and I just want to start out by saying that some of this comes from, we ran through our work very quickly and we recognize that, and some of this actually comes from a forthcoming case study that the CDC is working on releasing at some point as part of the Delta work. So hopefully that will give more in-depth context to some of our key lessons here. But as we do this work, we are constantly really trying to be aware of the key lessons that we're learning along the way. As I said, we're building this while we're flying it, so we're learning each and every day. But really, the key things that we've picked up is this idea of being aware of the historical disinvestment in communities that you're working with or partnering with, and our potential role in re-victimizing. And we're always trying to be very mindful of that and aware of that, especially as the coalition is considering ourselves a pretty mainstream organization. Being willing to hold ourselves and organizations accountable, not both in the present moment, but also historically, and really understanding, even as a movement, the accountability that's necessary and required.
If I can just add that we have a Prevention and Social Change Board Committee that's really trying to take a look at how to, what tools they can use and efforts to evaluate our work with a social justice lens. And so we're playing around with some different tools right now and using it against our work to kind of critique and constantly think about, how we use our resources, where our strategic plan is going, partnerships, how we're prioritizing our work.
Right. And then recognizing and validating trauma and prioritizing opportunities for that healing, resistance, and resilience, and really putting that, at the top of our focus and our priority, even if that means, that you're slowing down the timeline or, modifying or changing your goals. And then lastly, that expanded focus that Noelle just touched on. That idea of that we may be going in there, as an issues-based organization really focused on our issue, but that if we're, truly being guided by our understanding of community trauma, that we're going to really be there in solidarity and partnership to work with communities on what they feel are the most pressing issues or the most pressing needs. And we're going to be present for that and stand for that and really start to work across and between issues.
Thank you so much for that, and I would also love to hear from our guests from Virginia and what you all would like to share with the audience.
Okay. Hi, yes. So this is Leslie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So much like Delaware, we're looking at it from the trauma-informed lens that we always assume that trauma is in the room, and always acknowledging what that might mean for different communities that we work in. But also when we are, when we're talking about the movement, the movement itself has kind of taken on this shift where, first, when it first began, we wanted to hear the experiences of people who were, of our survivors and people who were actually like in the field and in the trenches. And somewhere along the line, it kind of became more professionalized, I guess. And I know that may not be a word, but so we're kind of getting back to listening to the voices of those who have lived through these experiences, who have, been impacted by these experiences, and really taking that into account. So that means, spending more time from the coalition perspective, spending more time in the field, spending more time in the local communities to really get a sense, and listening to our agencies that are in these communities and what's coming out of that. So really being intentional about listening to what comes out of those relationships. So those are probably two of the biggest lessons that we've learned at the coalition state level.
Great, thank you. And Adriana and Katie, I'm not sure if you have anything to add. If not, that's okay too.
Oh yeah, this is Adriana. I, completely agree with what Leslie said, and some of the notes that I added to the slides here, just being authentic, showing up as who you are, being aware of the complex trauma that people experience and the historical trauma and the systemic oppression and all of that stuff as you go into your work, checking your own privilege, and don't be self-serving, as Katie was discussing earlier, just showing up and doing what you can do to help.
Great, thank you all so much, and I think that we might be able to quickly go through some tools and resources, and all of these will be available on the Prevent Connect website, and I think a lot of them have been shared already. So I know that the folks from Virginia have a few. You can share this for a few minutes, a minute about what these resources are, folks in the audience.
Yeah, hi, this is Adriana again. I just wanted to place our website up on the page. It's thelaurelcenter.org. And if you do have any questions about how we're facilitating the DU program, please feel free to call us and ask to speak with Katie or myself. Our office number is there on the slide. It's the 667 or 540-667-6160. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. And Noelle and Lauren, I know you had spoke earlier about the report that you're going to share with us on the next slide about the People's Report, but if you could just share some resources with folks.
Yeah, the People's Report was really an amazing effort underway, and I'd encourage you to visit their website. And because also, it's difficult to talk about the violence and trauma in Wilmington, and I think this report, that comes from the community and really underscores how resilient residents, especially, Wilmington's 53% African American, so Black and Brown communities who have been marginalized and dealt with this chronic adversity, really have a high positive, an optimistic viewpoint, and people are just, the research shows how, people's participants overall were found to have high levels of psychological and social well-being and attitudes towards education, and so it's just a wonderful reminder of the resiliency of the human spirit, and helps us think more about all this other data that we get inundated with, and these national, media titles. And then the other report is Healing the Hurt, Trauma-Informed Approaches to the Health of Boys and Young Men of Color by the Drexel School of Public Health. And then the Bridge Housing, which I think the Prevention Institute has done some work with them before on these webinars around trauma-informed community building.
Great, thank you so much. And we have some resources too, but we'll make sure to put them on the Prevent Connect website. And we just wanted to thank you all again. Thank you to our guests for being here today. Thank you all in the audience for being on this web conference, as well as web conferences throughout the season. This is our last Prevent Connect for the season, but we are really thankful for all of your participation for the past 9 months or so, and are looking forward to what next season has to bring. So thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you all, and thank you, Casey, thank you, Lisa, thank you, Alicia, thank you, Allie, thank you to all of our guests, everyone in our audience. Beyond Partnerships, Shared Linkages for Prevention was the name of this series, and if you missed any, we encourage you to take a look at the archived recording. But this concludes our web conference for today, so thank you all. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and week. Take care.